My hands were still shaking when the second message came through. I am Commander Grace Dawson, tactical officer aboard the UES Ember Reach, and on the day this story truly begins, I was standing on the bridge, listening to a voice that did not belong to any human throat. It was thin, layered with static, and breaking apart every few words. It was the voice of a species called the Keltharian, and it was begging. Repeat, this is Colony Administrator Ressa Vondrel of the Keltharian Compact, transmitting on the emergency channel. Our defense grid has failed. Our shipyards are burning. We request immediate humanitarian assistance under Article 9 of the Interstellar Aid Accord. Please, we are not a military power. We cannot survive another wave. The bridge went quiet, not the calm kind of quiet. The kind where everyone is thinking the same terrible thought and nobody wants to say it first. Admiral Owen Pierce broke the silence. He did not raise his voice. He never did. Confirm the sender's registry status. Our communications officer, Lily Marsh, tapped through 3 screens before she answered. Confirmed, sir. Keltharian Compact, signatory to the Accord since it was founded. Non-combatant status. They don't maintain a standing military. Their charter says so directly. They rely on member species for defense. And the attacking force. Lily's fingers slowed. Unconfirmed contact signatures, but the damage pattern matches Vashtu hegemony configuration. Sir, if that's accurate, we are looking at a full invasion fleet, not a raid. I felt my stomach tighten. I had read about the Vashtu hegemony in briefings. Everyone had. They did not send fleets to negotiate. They sent fleets to conquer, and they had been doing it for longer than humanity had known these stars existed. The Admiral turned to me. Dawson, pull up the Keltharian system. I want to know what we're actually looking at before I answer that call. I brought the star chart onto the main display. The system blinked into existence, 3 inhabited worlds circling a soft yellow star, and around them, red markers multiplying by the second. Each red marker was a hostile contact. There were already too many to count individually. The system was drowning. Sir, I said, at current attrition, their outer colony falls within 6 hours. Their capital world holds longer, maybe 2 days, but only because of terrain and orbital debris slowing enemy approach vectors. They don't have anything that can be called a battle line. They have transport ships trying to run. The Admiral was silent for a long moment. Then he said the words that changed everything for me, though I did not understand it yet. Get me Fleet Command. Tell them the Compact is requesting aid under the Accord. Tell them I am requesting authorization to respond. I assumed, the way anyone would assume, that this meant medical frigates, supply ships, maybe an escort of a few destroyers to hold a defensive perimeter while evacuation convoys got survivors out. That was what aid meant. That was what every other species in this sector understood aid to mean. Ships that heal. Ships that carry food and shelter and doctors. That is not what Fleet Command sent back. The response came through 20 minutes later, and when Lily read it aloud, her voice cracked slightly on the final line. Authorization granted. Full deployment order issued. All available vessels of the Ashfall Battle Group are to proceed to Keltharian space immediately. Rules of engagement, unrestricted. Objective, neutralize hostile presence entirely. Compact survivors are secondary priority. Threat elimination is primary. Nobody on the bridge spoke. I want you to understand something about the Ashfall Battle Group, because at the time, most of the galaxy did not understand it either. Humanity had joined the wider interstellar community only a few decades earlier, and in that short time, we had earned a reputation nobody enjoyed discussing openly. Other species called us many things behind closed doors: unpredictable, excessive, uncomfortable to be around during a crisis. What they meant, without ever quite saying it, was that we came from a homeworld that had taught us war differently than it taught everyone else. Most species we had met built their militaries around restraint, around proportional response, around the idea that you use exactly enough force to stop a threat and no more, because anything beyond that was considered barbaric, wasteful, or dangerous to your own reputation. Humanity had never been taught that lesson, because our history had never allowed for it. We came from a world with too many people and too little patience, a world where hesitation had a body count attached to it. When humanity finally built starships and looked outward, we carried that history with us, whether the galaxy wanted us to or not. The Ashfall battle group was not a relief convoy. It was 17 warships built for exactly one purpose, and it was already moving. "Commander Dawson," the Admiral said, "set course. We drop out of FTL directly above the Keltharian capital. No staging point, no delay." "Sir, protocol calls for arrival at the designated diplomatic rendezvous coordinates, outside the system boundary. The compact will want time to prepare a formal reception." The Admiral looked at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something almost gentle in his expression, the kind of gentleness that comes right before someone tells you something hard. "Dawson, there is a colony burning down there right now. I am not interested in a reception." I gave the order. 17 ships turned as one, engines building toward the kind of speed that bent starlight around the hull, and I remember pressing my palm flat against the cold metal of my console, feeling the whole ship shudder as it committed to the jump. In the final seconds before we crossed into faster-than-light travel, Lily's console lit up with one last transmission from the compact administrator, sent before their main relay tower went dark. "Please hurry," the voice said. "We don't have anyone else to call." I did not know it then, but those 5 words would follow me for the rest of my career, because what came out of our jump point a few minutes later was not what anyone on that dying world was expecting to see. They had asked for aid. They had prayed for rescue. What they got instead was a fleet built by a species that had never learned how to do anything by half measures, and I was about to watch, for the first time, exactly what that meant. The jump alarm sounded through every deck of the Ember Reach, a low rising tone that meant 30 seconds until transition. I strapped into my chair and watched the star field outside the viewport begin to smear into long streaks of white and blue. My chest felt tight, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, heavy knowledge that we were about to become the answer to a prayer that nobody had actually understood when they made it. Admiral Pierce stood at the center of the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the countdown with an expression I would later learn to recognize on every human commander I ever served under. It was not excitement, it was not eagerness, it was the quiet, settled look of someone who had already made peace with what they were about to do, long before they had to do it. 15 seconds, Lily called out. I thought about Administrator Vondrell's voice, thin and desperate, asking for help in a language her people had probably never needed to use before now, because they had never needed saving in this way. The Compact had built a civilization on cooperation and diplomacy, on trusting that member species would answer when called. They had never imagined that the answer might frighten them almost as much as the threat itself. 10 seconds. I glanced at the tactical display one final time before the jump scrambled our sensors. The red markers around Keltharian had multiplied again. Whatever the Vashtu hegemony had sent to this system, it was not finished, and it clearly believed there was nothing in this sector capable of stopping it. 5, 4, 3. I gripped the edge of my console. 2, 1. The world went white, then black, then suddenly, violently, we were somewhere else entirely, and the first thing I saw on the other side of that jump was a colony world wrapped in fire and a fleet of alien warships that had absolutely no idea what had just arrived behind them. The colony world beneath us was called Threna Hold, and from orbit it looked like a wound that would not stop bleeding. Fires stretched across 3 continents, visible even through drifting smoke and cloud cover. Debris fields spun silently where compact transport ships had once tried to flee and failed. I had trained for combat simulations my entire career, but nothing had prepared me for the sight of an actual civilization in the process of dying. Multiple hostile contacts, 40+ and rising, Lily reported, her voice tight but controlled. They have not registered our arrival yet. Their sensor arrays appear focused inward, toward the surface. They're still finishing the job. I said quietly. "They don't expect anyone else to show up." Admiral Pierce nodded once. "Then let's correct that assumption. Dawson, open a channel to the compact flagship if anything of theirs is still transmitting." It took Lily almost a full minute to find a signal strong enough to lock onto. When the image finally resolved on our main display, I saw a bridge in far worse condition than ours. Sparks fell from a shattered console. Smoke hung in the air, and standing in the middle of it, remarkably composed given the circumstances, was a Keltharian officer with pale blue skin and wide, unblinking eyes that fixed on our display the moment the connection opened. "This is Fleet Liaison Corvin Thess," he said. "Identify yourselves. Are you the promised relief convoy?" I watched Admiral Pierce step into view of the camera. "Liaison Thess, this is Admiral Owen Pierce of the Human Ashfall Battle Group, responding to your distress call under Accord Article 9. Corvin Thess blinked, slowly, the way I imagine someone does when they are trying to process something that does not match their expectations. "Battle Group. I was told to expect medical vessels, evacuation transports." "You'll have those as well," the Admiral said. "But first, we're going to deal with the reason you need them." There was a pause, and in it, I watched the liaison's expression shift from confusion into something closer to alarm. Behind him, another compact officer leaned into frame, whispering something urgent. Corvin Thess's already pale skin seemed to lose what little color it had left. "Admiral, I must be clear with you. Our charter, and the wider Accord itself, expects assistance to follow proportional response guidelines. We are asking you to help us survive, not to escalate the conflict beyond what is necessary to protect civilian life." I saw the Admiral's jaw tighten, just barely, the only outward sign that the comment had landed somewhere uncomfortable. "Liaison Thess, with respect, your civilians are dying while we're having this conversation. I don't intend to have a debate about proportionality with an enemy fleet parked over your capital." "But you don't understand what you're proposing," Corvin Thess said, and there was real fear in his voice now, not for himself, I realized, but for what he thought we were about to become. "The Vashtu hegemony is a warrior culture. They respect strength shown with restraint. If you respond with overwhelming force, you risk provoking their high command into declaring this a matter of honor rather than conquest. You could turn a raid into a war that consumes this entire sector." Admiral Pierce was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost none of its calm, but something underneath it had hardened. "Liaison Thess, I've read the reports on the Vashtu hegemony. This isn't their first colony raid, and it won't be their last, regardless of how we respond today. The only question is whether Threna Hold survives long enough to matter. I intend to make sure it does." The channel briefly filled with the sound of Corvin Thess turning to argue with someone off camera, his voice rising in a language our translators struggled to keep pace with. When he turned back, his composure had returned, but his eyes carried something new, not gratitude exactly, not yet, something closer to dread, mixed with desperate hope, the look of someone who has just realized the rescue they asked for may cost more than they were prepared to pay. "Do what you must," he finally said. "We have no other option remaining." The channel closed, and the bridge fell into that particular silence that comes right before everything changes. "Dawson," the Admiral said, "battle stations. All ships form standard interdiction pattern around the capital. I want a perimeter that nothing gets through, in either direction." I moved through the sequence with hands that had gone steady the moment there was work to do. Fear, I had learned early in my career, becomes much easier to manage once you have something specific to focus on. "Perimeter forming, sir. 17 ships spreading across 3 defensive rings. Enemy contacts still show no reaction." "Copy that. Tactical assessment, Dawson." "What are we facing?" I studied the sensor returns scrolling across my console, cross-referencing hull signatures against every database we carried. 43 confirmed hostile vessels, ranging from light raiders to what looks like 2 heavy cruisers anchoring their formation. Their weapons profile suggests focused energy cannons, decent shielding, moderate maneuverability. "Sir, This is not their full invasion force. This looks like an occupation garrison, left behind to finish clearing resistance while their main fleet moves on to the next target. Which means reinforcements could already be inbound elsewhere, the Admiral said, more to himself than to me. Yes, sir. If we don't end this quickly and decisively, we're not just fighting for Threna Hold, we're setting the tone for whatever comes next. The Admiral nodded slowly, and I watched him make the calculation that every commander eventually has to make, the one where you weigh caution against consequence and decide which mistake you can live with. Then we don't give them the option of retreating to warn their command. Dawson, signal the fleet. We move on my order, full engagement, no gradual escalation. I want this ended before their high command even knows we exist. I relayed the order, and across 17 ships, I felt the subtle shift that comes when an entire fleet stops preparing and starts committing. Weapon systems came online in sequence, a low-hum building through the deck plating beneath my boots. On the display, our formation tightened, converging toward the edge of the enemy's unsuspecting perimeter. Lily's voice cut through the quiet. "Sir, we're being hailed. It's the Keltharian administrator again, planet-side." Patch her through. Administrator Vondrel's face appeared on a smaller display, streaked with soot, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp with focus. "Admiral Pierce, thank you for answering our call. I want you to know, whatever happens today, our people will remember this." "Just get your civilians to shelter, Administrator," the Admiral said. "We'll handle the rest." She hesitated before the connection closed, glancing at something off-screen with an expression I could not quite read. "Admiral, one more thing. Please, try to remember that many of these Vashtu soldiers were conscripted. Not all of them chose this." The Admiral's expression did not change, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten again. "Understood, Administrator. We'll do what we can." The connection ended, and for a moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. I understood then that the Admiral had just been asked to promise restraint he was not entirely certain he could deliver, not because he lacked discipline, but because our fleet had been built and trained around a single unforgiving principle, that threats left half-finished simply come back stronger. "Formation locked," Lily reported. "All ships report ready status." Admiral Pierce straightened, and his voice, when it came, filled the bridge with a weight I would carry with me for the rest of my career. "All ships, this is Ashfall Actual. We are not here to negotiate a ceasefire. We are here to end a threat before it ends an entire world. Weapons free on my mark." I stared at the tactical display, at the unsuspecting enemy fleet still hovering over a burning colony, utterly convinced that nothing in this sector could threaten them. I thought about Corvin Thess's warning, about honor and escalation and wars that could consume a sector. I thought about the fear I had seen behind his eyes, fear not just of the Vashtu hegemony, but of us. "Mark," the Admiral said, and the sky above Threna Hold changed forever. The first sign the Vashtu fleet had of our presence was not a warning shot. It was a wall of coordinated fire arriving from 3 directions at once, and I remember watching their formations scatter in confusion before they even understood what they were reacting to. "Contact confirmed," Lily called out. "Enemy fleet is breaking formation. They're trying to identify the source." "Too late for that," I said, watching our opening volley strike home across their outer picket line. Shields flared bright against the dark, one after another, some holding, some collapsing entirely under the concentrated impact. On a normal battlefield, an opening exchange like that would have been considered a warning, a demonstration of capability meant to invite negotiation. Our fleet did not fire warning shots. We fired to finish engagements before they properly began. "Enemy light raiders attempting evasive maneuvers," I reported. "Their heavy cruisers are turning to engage directly." "Let them," Admiral Pierce said. "Dawson, redirect the Hollow Vein and the Ashgrave line to intercept the cruisers. Everyone else holds the perimeter and mops up the raiders." I relayed the order, watching 2 of our destroyers peel away from the main formation with a precision that still, after years of service, gave me a strange sense of pride mixed with unease. Human fleet doctrine did not believe in holding ships in reserve out of caution. It believed in committing exactly the right amount of force to end an engagement as quickly as possible, because every extra minute of combat was another minute civilians spent in danger. On the display, I watched one of the enemy light raiders attempt to break through our perimeter toward open space, likely trying to escape and warn the wider Vashtu command structure. It never reached the edge of our formation. A single interceptor from the Ember Reach's fighter wing crossed its path, and the raider's engines flared once, twice, then went dark entirely as it was disabled and left drifting. "Nice work, Hawkins," I murmured, recognizing the pilot's call sign on the tactical feed. "Just doing the job, Commander," came the reply over comms, calm as if she were running a routine drill instead of stopping an enemy retreat in real time. The two heavy cruisers proved a tougher problem. Their shielding was better than our initial estimates, and their weapons cut through the darkness in wide arcs, forcing the hollow vein to roll hard to avoid a direct hit. I watched the ship's hull shudder on our sensor feed as a glancing blow scraped along its shielding. "Hollow vein reports shields at 70%, Lily said. "They're requesting permission to fall back and regroup." Admiral Pierce did not hesitate. "Denied. Dawson, redirect 2 support cruisers to reinforce. I want those heavy cruisers disabled within the next 4 minutes, not eventually." I understood the urgency behind that order even before he finished speaking. Every minute the battle continued was another minute the Vashtu garrison had a chance to get a distress signal off-world, and every minute after that was another chance for reinforcements to arrive and turn this from a rescue into a prolonged siege. "Redirecting the Pharaoh Ridge and the Cinder Vale now," I confirmed. The battle unfolded across my display, less like the wide, dramatic clashes I had trained for in simulations, and more like a series of rapid, brutal decisions made in fractions of a second. I watched our formation collapse the enemy's flanks methodically, cutting off retreat routes before targeting propulsion systems, forcing surrender or destruction with almost mechanical efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no pause to allow the enemy an opportunity to regroup or reconsider. It was, I realized as I watched it happen, exactly what Corvin Thess had feared when he spoke of proportionality. This was not restraint shown to invite negotiation. This was overwhelming force applied with total commitment, meant to end the threat so completely that there would be nothing left capable of retaliation. "Enemy heavy cruiser designated Cruiser 1 is losing power across multiple systems," I reported. "They're attempting to broadcast a surrender signal." "Copy that," Admiral Pierce said. "Hold fire on that vessel. Continue engagement on Cruiser 2 and remaining raiders." I felt something ease slightly in my chest at that order, a small proof that our fleet's overwhelming force was not the same as indiscriminate force. We stopped firing on ships that stopped fighting. It was a distinction I clung to throughout the engagement, because without it, I am not certain I could have kept doing my job that day. The remaining raiders scattered in increasingly desperate patterns, some attempting to flee toward the outer system, others turning to make a final stand near the wreckage of their own formation. I watched our fleet's fighter wings weave between debris fields with a precision that made the chaos around them look almost choreographed, disabling engines, targeting weapon arrays, methodically stripping the enemy fleet of its ability to continue fighting. "Cruiser 2's shields are failing," I called out. "They're breaking off, attempting retreat toward the jump point on the far side of the system." "They won't make it," Admiral Pierce said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice, only certainty. "Dawson, redirect the Ember Reach's forward battery. Target their propulsion systems only. I want that ship stopped, not destroyed." I input the coordinates with steady hands, watching our own ship shift course to intercept. Through the viewport, I could see the enemy cruiser growing larger, trailing plasma from a damaged engine housing, running with the particular desperation of something that knows it cannot escape but tries anyway. Our forward battery fired twice, precise strikes aimed exactly where the Admiral had specified. The cruiser's remaining engines flared and died, leaving the massive vessel drifting silently against the backdrop of stars, disabled but intact. Cruiser 2 is dead in space, I confirmed. No further weapons fire detected from their position. Good, the Admiral said. Hold position. Let's see if they're smart enough to surrender. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cruiser drifted in silence, and I found myself holding my breath, watching the sensor readout for any sign of continued resistance. Then, finally, a weak signal blinked onto our comms display, a formal surrender broadcast, transmitted in the halting, unpolished translation of a crew that had clearly never expected to need such a message prepared. "They're surrendering," Lily confirmed, relief evident in her voice. Across the rest of the system, the remaining engagement wound down with similar speed. Within 11 minutes of our first shot, the Vashtu garrison fleet had been reduced from 43 active vessels to a scattering of disabled hulks, a handful of destroyed raiders, and 2 ships that had managed to slip away before our perimeter fully closed, vanishing into FTL with whatever warning they could carry back to their command structure. I remember the silence that followed almost as vividly as the battle itself. The bridge, which had been filled with rapid reports and tactical calls only minutes earlier, settled into a stillness that felt heavier than any noise could have been. "Casualty report," Admiral Pierce said quietly. "No losses among our fleet, sir," Lily said. "Minor damage to the Hollow Vein and the Ashgrave Line, both operational. Enemy losses: 26 vessels destroyed, 14 disabled and surrendered, 2 escaped." The Admiral nodded slowly, absorbing the numbers without visible reaction, though I had served with him long enough to recognize the small tightening around his eyes that meant he was already thinking about the 2 ships that had escaped and what warning they might carry. I turned my attention back to the main display, where the compact liaison channel was already lighting up with an incoming transmission. When Corvin Thess's face appeared, I did not see relief in his expression, at least not at first. I saw something closer to shock, the particular kind that comes from watching something happen so quickly and completely that your mind has not yet caught up to processing it. "Admiral," he said, his voice unsteady, "the engagement, it's over." "Confirmed," Admiral Pierce said. "Threna Hold's orbital space is secure. We'll begin coordinating evacuation and medical support immediately." Corvin Thess was quiet for a long moment, glancing at something off-screen before returning his attention to the camera. 11 minutes, Admiral. Our defense grid held out for 6 hours against a fraction of that force before it fell entirely. You ended the same threat in 11 minutes. We had better tools for the job, the Admiral said simply. That's one way to describe it, Corvin Thess murmured, and I could not tell, watching his expression, whether he meant it as gratitude or as something closer to a warning to himself about what he had just witnessed. I glanced toward the viewport, toward the drifting wreckage and disabled cruisers now surrounded by our fleet's recovery teams, and toward the burning surface of Threna Hold beyond it, fires already beginning to be addressed by emergency teams moving in from our support vessels. We had done exactly what we came to do. We had ended the threat, completely and without hesitation, exactly the way our doctrine demanded. But as I watched Corvin Thess's expression through the display, pale and shaken despite the victory laid out before him, I understood for the first time that we had not simply rescued the Keltharian Compact that day. We had shown them something about ourselves that they would spend a long time trying to decide how to feel about, and I suspected, watching that uncertain look on his face, that the hardest part of this mission was not the battle we had just finished. It was about to be everything that came after it. The council chamber aboard the Keltharian capital station had clearly not been designed for a meeting like this one. It was built for trade disputes and resource allocation, not for deciding the fate of 14 surrendered enemy ships and their crews, and I could see that discomfort reflected in every face around the table when I arrived with Admiral Pierce 2 hours after the battle ended. Administrator Vondrell sat at the head of the table, her exhaustion visible despite an attempt at composure. Corvin Thess stood near a wall display showing real-time status updates on the disabled Vashtu vessels still held within our perimeter. Several other compact officials filled the remaining seats, their expressions ranging from cautious relief to open unease. Admiral Pierce, Commander Dawson, thank you for joining us. Administrator Vondrel said, we have a matter requiring immediate discussion regarding the surrendered enemy personnel. I assumed as much, the Admiral said, taking a seat across from her. What's the concern? Corvin Thess stepped forward, gesturing toward the display. Under compact law, surrendered combatants are entitled to formal processing, medical treatment, and eventual repatriation negotiations through neutral diplomatic channels. It is a system we have used successfully for generations with other conflicts in this region. That sounds reasonable, I said, though I could already sense where the conversation was heading. It is reasonable, under normal circumstances, Corvin Thess continued. But we have never processed a surrender following an engagement quite like the one your fleet conducted today. Several of the captured crew are, to put it plainly, terrified, not of imprisonment, of you. Administrator Vondrel leaned forward. Admiral, one of the captured officers, a mid-ranking commander from the second cruiser, has specifically requested that compact personnel handle his processing and detention rather than your fleet. He has stated, repeatedly, that he does not trust human forces to follow what he understands as acceptable rules of engagement toward captured enemies. I watched the Admiral's expression carefully. He did not look offended, exactly, but something in his posture straightened, the way it did whenever he felt a decision was being questioned without full context. We have no intention of mistreating surrendered personnel, Administrator. Our doctrine is very clear on that point. Once a threat stops fighting, it stops being a target. I believe that, Administrator Vondrel said carefully. But belief and demonstrated precedent are different things, Admiral, and this captured commander has no precedent to draw on. He has only rumors, the kind that circulate through hegemony ranks about Deathworlder forces. Rumors that, frankly, your fleet did very little to disprove today. I felt the weight of that statement settle over the room. It was not an accusation exactly, but it carried the shape of one, and I found myself thinking back to Corvin Thess's warning before the battle, about proportionality and honor and the risk of escalation. I understood now that the concern had never fully gone away. It had simply been set aside in the urgency of the moment, and now it was returning in a different form. Perhaps it would help, I said, choosing my words carefully, if I spoke with the commander directly. Sometimes a conversation clears up more than a policy briefing can. Administrator Vondrel glanced at Corvin Thess, who nodded slightly. That may be wise, Commander Dawson. He has agreed to speak with a human representative, provided compact personnel remain present throughout. I looked to Admiral Pierce, who considered the request for a long moment before nodding once. Go ahead, Dawson. Report back what you learn. The detention area aboard the compact station had been hastily converted from what looked like a storage facility, still bearing the marks of quick modification, reinforced barriers installed within hours of our arrival. The captured Vashtu commander sat behind a transparent partition, and when I first saw him, I understood immediately why Administrator Vondrel had described him as terrified rather than defiant. He was younger than I expected, his posture rigid with a kind of controlled fear that reminded me, uncomfortably, of prey trying not to draw attention to itself. When he spoke, his translated voice carried a flatness that suggested exhaustion more than composure. You are the human officer, he said. It was not quite a question. Commander Grace Dawson, I said, taking the seat across from him, Corvin Thess standing quietly nearby. And you are? Designation Kresh Ulvain, formerly commanding officer of the cruiser you disabled. Formerly, because I do not expect to hold that title much longer, regardless of what happens to me here. Why do you say that? Kresh Ulvan's expression, insofar as I could read alien features still unfamiliar to me, seemed to carry something close to bitter amusement. Because my own command structure does not forgive failure gently, Commander, and losing an entire garrison fleet in 11 minutes to a force nobody warned us about counts as a significant failure. I absorbed that for a moment. You didn't know we were coming. Nobody warned us that Deathworlders would respond to a distress call with a full combat fleet, he said. We were told humanity operated under restraint doctrines similar to most species in this sector. We were told any response would likely be defensive in nature, focused on protecting the colony rather than actively hunting our garrison. Your intelligence was wrong, I said simply. Clearly. He studied me for a long moment. May I ask you something directly, Commander, without it being held against me? Go ahead. Was today's engagement standard practice for your fleet, or was it an exception made for a distress call you considered particularly urgent? I thought carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said would likely travel back through hegemony channels eventually, shaping how they understood us going forward. It was standard practice. We don't have a separate doctrine for urgent situations. We treat every threat to civilian life as urgent. Kresh Ulvain was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that answer with an expression I could not fully read. Then I understand now why the rumors about your species exist. I had assumed they were exaggerated. Propaganda, perhaps, meant to justify caution among conscripted forces like myself. Were you conscripted? Most of the garrison was, he admitted. The hegemony's occupation campaigns require significant personnel. Not all of us volunteered for this particular assignment. I thought of Administrator Vondrell's request before the battle, her plea to remember that not every soldier had chosen this fight. I understood now why that request had mattered so much to her. That's part of why the Admiral gave the order to accept surrender rather than pursue total destruction, I said. We don't extend that consideration to command structures making the decision to invade. We do extend it to individuals who stop fighting. Kresh Ulvain's posture shifted slightly, some of the rigid tension easing, though not entirely. That distinction was not obvious to me during the battle, Commander. From where I stood, it looked like total destruction was exactly your intention. I understand why it looked that way, I said honestly. We don't fight with restraint built into the middle of an engagement. We fight to end threats as quickly and completely as possible. But we do extend restraint once a threat stops being a threat. Your surrender was accepted the moment you broadcast it. Nobody fired on your ship after that signal went out. He considered that for a long moment, glancing briefly toward Corvin Thess, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. I would like to formally request continued detention under compact custody rather than human custody, if that request is honored. It will be, I said. The Admiral has no interest in holding surrendered personnel beyond what's necessary for processing. Compact custody was always the intended outcome. Something in Kresh Ulvain's expression shifted again, this time towards something closer to genuine surprise. I was told that would not be an option, that your fleet would insist on holding prisoners under your own authority for interrogation purposes. That's not how we operate, I said. We came to end a threat to civilian life, not to expand our own influence in this sector. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different quality than before, something closer to careful reconsideration. Then perhaps the rumors about your species are incomplete, Commander. Perhaps you are dangerous specifically because you are willing to become anything a situation requires, without hesitation, and then simply stop being that thing once it's no longer necessary. I did not have a ready response to that observation, in part because I suspected he had described something true about us that I had never fully articulated to myself. I'll relay your request to the Admiral, I said instead. Compact custody, formal processing under Article 9 protocols. As I left the detention area, Corvin Thess fell into step beside me, his expression thoughtful. That conversation was informative, Commander Dawson. How so? Because I believe Commander Ulvain just described, without meaning to, the exact reason our compact leadership has spent the last several hours debating whether requesting your fleet's assistance again in the future would be wise, despite today's outcome being an unquestionable success. I glanced at him, understanding the weight behind his careful phrasing. You're worried about what it costs to be saved by us. I am worried, Corvin Thess said slowly, about what it means that we are grateful for something that frightened us this deeply. I am not certain our compact has fully reconciled those two feelings yet, Commander. I suspect it will take considerably longer than today to manage that. We walked the rest of the corridor in silence, and I found myself thinking about Kresh Ulvain's words, about becoming anything a situation requires, and stopping the moment it stopped being necessary. I wondered, not for the first time that day, whether the rest of the galaxy would ever fully understand that distinction, or whether they would simply remember the 11 minutes it took to end an invasion fleet and quietly decide never to test us again. 6 weeks after the battle above Threna Hold, I stood on the surface of the colony for the first time, watching human engineering teams work alongside compact laborers to rebuild a water treatment facility that had been destroyed in the opening hours of the invasion. The fires were long gone. The debris had mostly been cleared. What remained was the slow, unglamorous work of putting a shattered world back together, and I had not expected how deeply it would affect me to watch it happen. "You look surprised, Commander," Administrator Vondrel said, walking up beside me with a data tablet in hand. "I suppose I am," I admitted. "I didn't expect to spend 6 weeks helping rebuild water systems after what happened up there." I gestured toward the sky. "Neither did we," she said, a small, tired smile crossing her face. "When your fleet requested extended deployment for reconstruction support, several members of our council assumed it was a formality, that your forces would depart quickly once the immediate threat was addressed. Instead, your engineers have been here longer than some of our own reconstruction teams." "That's how it works," I said. "We don't consider a mission finished just because the fighting stops." She studied me for a moment, an expression I had come to recognize over the past several weeks, the particular mixture of gratitude and quiet unease that seemed to follow every interaction our people had with the Compact since the battle. "It's a strange thing, Commander, watching the same species that ended an invasion fleet in 11 minutes spend 6 weeks helping repair irrigation systems for farmers who will likely never even meet you. Is it strange in a bad way?" "I'm not certain yet," she said honestly. "I think that's part of what makes it strange." I had heard versions of that sentiment repeated throughout the sector in the weeks since the battle, filtered through diplomatic channels and quiet conversations with Compact officials who seemed to be working through the same complicated reaction. Gratitude that did not sit comfortably alongside fear. Relief that carried an undercurrent of caution. I understood it, even if I could not fully resolve it myself. That evening, I received word that Admiral Pierce had been summoned to appear before the wider Interstellar Council, the governing body that oversaw the Accord and its member species, to formally account for the Ashfall Battle Group's response at Threna Hold. I was asked to accompany him, given my direct involvement in both the engagement and the subsequent discussions with Compact leadership. The council chamber, when we arrived 2 days later, was unlike anything aboard the small Compact station. It was a vast circular room, representatives from a dozen species arranged in tiered seating around a central platform, each delegation marked by its own distinct presence, some physical, some purely holographic. I felt distinctly out of place standing beside the Admiral at the center of that platform, aware of how many eyes, and sensory organs that were not eyes at all, were fixed on us. The council chair, a tall, silver-skinned representative from a species I did not recognize, opened the session with formal procedural language before turning directly to Admiral Pierce. "Admiral Pierce, this council has reviewed the full record of your fleet's response to the Keltharian distress call. The engagement itself is not in dispute. Colony records confirm your intervention prevented significant loss of civilian life, and reconstruction support since then has been, by all accounts, thorough and genuinely appreciated." "Thank you," the Admiral said evenly. "However," the chair continued, and I felt the room's attention sharpen, "several delegations have raised concerns regarding the nature of your response. Specifically, the decision to deploy a full combat fleet with unrestricted engagement authorization in response to what was formally classified as a request for humanitarian aid." A representative from a delegation I recognized as the Threll Assembly, a species known throughout the sector for their strict adherence to proportional response doctrine, rose slightly from their seat. "Admiral, with respect, this council exists in part to prevent conflicts from escalating beyond their original scope. Your fleet's response, however effective, sets a precedent that concerns many of us. If every distress call risks receiving a response of that magnitude, what assurance do smaller species have that conflicts will remain contained? I watched Admiral Pierce absorb the question without visible reaction, though I had come to recognize the small, deliberate pause he took before answering questions he considered important. "I understand the concern," he said finally, "but I'd ask the Council to consider the alternative. A measured, proportional response to that distress call would likely have arrived too late, or with insufficient force, to prevent the loss of an entire colony. We chose to end the threat completely, rather than manage it gradually. At the cost of the enemy's ability to negotiate or withdraw," another delegate pointed out, this one from a species with a translated voice that carried a sharp, clipped cadence. "Your fleet gave the Vashtu garrison 11 minutes before their formation was effectively destroyed. That is not a response calibrated for negotiation." "No," the Admiral agreed, "it wasn't, because the garrison in question had already spent 6 hours ignoring every opportunity for negotiation the Compact's own defense forces offered them. We did not arrive to open a dialogue with an invasion fleet. We arrived to end one." The chamber fell into a heavy silence, and I felt the weight of dozens of unfamiliar gazes settling on us, some curious, some clearly uneasy. It was Administrator Vondrel, present as a formal witness for the Compact, who finally broke the silence. "If I may address the Council directly," she said, rising from her seat, "I understand the concerns raised here today. I shared many of them myself, in the hours before the human fleet arrived at Threna Hold, but I would ask this Council to remember something important. We requested aid because our own doctrine of proportional response had already failed us. 6 hours of measured, careful defense resulted in a colony on the verge of complete destruction. 11 minutes of unrestricted response resulted in that colony's survival." She paused, glancing briefly toward the Admiral before continuing. "I am not certain the galaxy is prepared to fully embrace how humanity fights. I am certain that my people are alive today because of it, and I am not willing to pretend that distinction does not matter." The Council chair allowed the statement to settle before turning back to Admiral Pierce. "Admiral, this Council does not intend to restrict your species' right to respond to future distress calls as you see fit, provided such responses remain within the Accord's basic framework regarding civilian protection. However, we would ask for clarity, for the record, so that future requests for aid can be made with full understanding of what response they may receive. Why did your fleet respond to a request for humanitarian assistance with what amounted to a full combat deployment?" I watched Admiral Pierce consider the question carefully, and when he finally answered, his voice carried the same calm certainty I had heard from him on the bridge of the Ember Reach, moments before we gave the order to engage. "Because the request asked us to save the Compact's people," he said. "It did not specify how." The chamber remained silent for a long moment following that answer, and I found myself thinking back to every moment of the past 6 weeks, from the panic in Administrator Vondrel's voice during that first distress call, to Corvin Thess's careful warnings about proportionality, to Kresh Ulvain's quiet observation about a species willing to become anything a situation required. I understood, standing in that chamber, that the Admiral's answer was not meant to be clever or provocative. It was simply true, and it captured something about humanity that the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand. We did not measure our response to suffering by what seemed reasonable or proportional. We measured it by what actually stopped the suffering, as quickly and completely as we were capable of stopping it, and we accepted whatever discomfort that caused afterward as the price of getting the job done. In the weeks that followed, word of the Council session spread throughout the sector, and I watched, with a strange mixture of pride and unease, as humanity's reputation shifted once again. We were no longer simply the unpredictable newcomers whose military doctrine made other species uneasy. We had become something more specific, more defined, a known quantity that other civilizations now factored carefully into their calculations. Some species began quietly adjusting their own distress protocols, adding additional clarifying language specifically to avoid triggering the kind of unrestricted response we had shown at Threna Hold. Others, smaller and more vulnerable species living near contested borders, began requesting formal defense partnerships with humanity, having decided that whatever discomfort came with our methods was worth the certainty of survival they provided. I returned to Threna Hold one final time before the Ember Reach was reassigned to a different sector, walking through streets that had been rubble only months earlier, now filled with the ordinary business of daily life continuing forward. Children ran through a rebuilt marketplace. Farmers loaded transport vehicles with the season's first successful harvest since the invasion. It was, in every visible way, a community healing. Administrator Vondrell met me near the edge of the market, watching the same scene with an expression I had grown familiar with over the months. Gratitude layered carefully over something more complicated underneath. "I've been thinking about something Liaison Thess said to you after the battle," she told me, "about your species being willing to become anything a situation requires, and then simply stopping once it's no longer necessary." "I remember," I said. "I think that's the part the rest of the galaxy will struggle with the longest," she said. "Not the 11 minutes it took you to end an invasion fleet, the 6 weeks it took you afterward to help us rebuild irrigation systems, without complaint, without seeking anything in return. Both things happen because of the same underlying nature, and I don't think most species are equipped to hold both truths about you at once." I considered that for a long moment, watching the market continue its quiet, ordinary rhythm around us. "Maybe they don't have to hold both truths at once," I said finally. "Maybe they just need to trust that when they call for help, we'll show up ready to do whatever the situation actually requires, and figure out how they feel about that afterward." Administrator Vondrell was quiet for a moment, then offered a small, genuine smile, the first I had seen from her that carried no trace of underlying unease. "I think, Commander Dawson, that after everything this world has been through, that is exactly the kind of help we needed most." As the Ember Reach prepared to depart Keltharian space for the last time, I stood at the observation deck, watching Threna Hold shrink slowly into the distance behind us, its surface no longer marked by fire, its people no longer waiting anxiously for a rescue that might arrive too late, or not at all. I thought about the desperate voice that had first reached us weeks earlier, asking simply for someone to hurry, because there was no one else left to call. They had asked us to save their people. They had never specified how. And somewhere in that simple, unintentional gap between the request and the response, humanity had once again shown the galaxy exactly who we were. An answer that some would fear, some would rely on, and all of them, eventually, would have to learn to understand.